Watch right now on the Front News Project. Exclusive footage. The Ukrainian armed forces turned it into a bloodbath for Russian troops near Pokrovsk. Exclusive material straight from the front lines. NATO's army is already at Russia's border. Karelia and Panika are preparing for war with the alliance. And enemy Shaheds are about to become even more dangerous. You need to know this. Watch fiery, intense, and blazing footage from the front lines right now. Hello, this is Vladimir Timoshenko with you, and we're starting right away with the main topic. The soldiers of the 155th Separate Mechanized Brigade, named after Anna of Kiev, turned the Pokrovsk direction into a real bloodbath for the occupiers. In a minute, we'll show you this footage, and also the GUR operation in Pokrovsk. A ground corridor was opened up to our special forces, and additional troops have joined them. Our journalists know all the details of what's happening.
The decisive battle for Pokrovsk continues. Russian troops are advancing within the city, but Ukrainian forces are holding the defense and launching counterattacks, slowing down the enemy's actions. The defense forces continue clearing Pokrovsk of occupiers now in the northern part of the city. This became possible because over the past few days it was possible to reinforce with personnel and equipment. After a successful airborne operation, additional special forces units joined the GUR commandos, who had secured certain positions and opened a ground corridor. According to the president of Ukraine, special operations of various kinds are taking place in Pokrovsk, but most of them should not be discussed. Russian troops are trying to break through the Ukrainian armed forces' defenses, attacking in several directions at once. They have concentrated the largest number of soldiers and officers here.
According to various estimates by the Ukrainian command, around 100,000 Russian servicemen are directly or indirectly involved in this entire operation around Pokrovsk. These are approximate figures, just to give you an idea of the scale of forces involved. In fact, I'll go even further. There have been instances from the direction of Sumy region and from the direction of Kostiantynivka. Forces have been redeployed from these directions toward Pokrovsk to reinforce because they are short on manpower.
We're talking about so-called kamikazes, that is, contract soldiers with an average life expectancy of 12 days. So accordingly, these are special units of the Russian army, plus of course Marine brigades. In particular, the 155th Marine Brigade has been redeployed to the Pokrovsk direction with a specific mission.
According to the Institute for the Study of War, the occupiers have advanced in the southern part of Mirnohrad and in eastern Rudinske, gradually approaching the city of Pokrovsk itself.
At this point, there is no reason to say that Russian occupation forces have established a foothold directly in Mirnohrad. At present, the presence of Russian occupiers has been verified at the territory of the Mine Administration 5.2.6 near Rudinske. It should be noted that the situation is changing dynamically. In other words, the occupiers are trying to intensify their offensive in order to take direct control of locations held by the Ukrainian Defense Forces. The Ukrainian Defense Forces are conducting counterattacks to prevent further advances by the Russian occupiers.
The enemy is trying to capture Pokrovsk and the nearby settlements surrounding them and is increasing the number of air attacks. In particular, they are using glide bombs and drones.
There is no classic encirclement as it is usually described in textbooks around the city of Pokrovsk. In other words, there is no solid ring. It is not closed. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, the part that is still open is about 5 kilometers wide. But it's an extremely critical distance and it no longer matters because Russian drones are already there, Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups are already present, shells are flying in, and over the past week, the situation for the movement of Ukrainian troops has become as bad as possible.
According to the General Staff, over the past 24 hours, Ukrainian defenders have stopped 55 assault actions by the aggressor.
During these combined attacks, up to a tank battalion is used. Of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, that's more than 30 units of heavy armored vehicles. Moreover, they are using a no price is too high tactic. The occupiers are well aware of the superiority of Ukraine's defense forces in the use of FPV drones, and only about 20% of the heavy armored vehicles and accordingly personnel actually reach the positions of Ukraine's defense forces.
Despite the enemy's active operations, the AFU continue to hold their positions and destroy enemy forces.
Over the past week, the defense forces of Ukraine have successfully counterattacked and managed to liberate 4 settlements: Kucheryavi Yar, Suketske Zatishok, and Shahed. At the moment, the occupiers are trying to intensify their offensive along the flanks of the Ukrainian grouping, specifically in the area of Vladimirovka, with the threat of advancing toward Refrain. These are combined attacks involving armored vehicles. And in the area of Rodinsk.
On the eastern flank of the Pokrovsk operation, in the area of Dobropilya, Ukrainian forces have liberated part of the territory that Russian troops had previously advanced into. According to analysts, the Donetsk region remains the main direction of Russia's offensive this winter, with the goal of achieving significant results by spring 2025.
And here is another extremely important topic. The fate of the head of the Russian General Staff, Gerasimov, is hanging by a thread. Putin will dismiss him if the occupiers do not capture Pokrovsk by mid-November. And by the way, a candidate to succeed Gerasimov has already been chosen. Who is this so-called lucky one? The answer is in our report.
The last leg of Valery Gerasimov's chair has broken. According to reports from the Kremlin is very dissatisfied with the general's work and, to put it mildly, his less than truthful reports from the front, according to the Atesh movement, citing information from officers of one of the Russian military groups.
Putin gave Gerasimov a deadline to capture Pokrovsk by mid-November. This order is the general's last chance to keep his position. Against the backdrop of this ultimatum, there has been a sharp increase in meat grinder tactics on the Pokrovsk front. The command is sending huge waves of personnel into suicidal attacks in order to fulfill the order at any cost.
Unremarkable and lacking charisma, Valery Gerasimov is the man to whom Putin owes his first presidential term. It was he who, while Moscow was preparing to check boxes on ballots, led the combat operations for the village of Komsomolskoye. This 15-day battle became the key and final one in Russia's second Chechen campaign. Gerasimov delivered victory to candidate Putin, stepping over bathtubs of blood, over the countless corpses of Russian soldiers and local residents.
The residents were allowed to leave the village, but they weren't allowed to go far. They were forced to stay for several days on the outskirts of the village, but in reality, they served as a human shield. In
2012, it was Gerasimov who presented the country's leadership with the formula for hybrid warfare. At that time, he insisted that it was necessary to move away from classical wars.
This ongoing situation is moving towards destabilization on the ground, meaning that the environment in the area is becoming less stable and more uncertain.
A little later, the Gerasimov formula was tested by the Russians first in Crimea and then in Donbas. According to Bellingcat investigators, it was Valery Gerasimov who, in 2014, initiated the deployment of regular Russian troops near Ukrainian Ilovaisk and the transfer of Russian military equipment to the separatists, from which, by the way, the Malaysian Boeing was shot down, the silent Gerasimov, as he is called among themselves. The Grey Cardinal of the General Staff has outlasted all his flamboyant and loud
Critics are individuals who analyze, evaluate, and provide their opinions on various forms of art, literature, music, movies, or other creative works. Their reviews and assessments help audiences understand the strengths and weaknesses of these works, guiding public perception and influencing cultural conversations. Ammo stockpile is currently at 70% as of now. Shoigu, Gerasimov, where the hell are the munitions?
Prigozhin has been blown up, Strelkov-Gherkin is rotting behind bars. After the scandal, it was thanks to Valery Gerasimov's efforts that the favorite of Russian Z patriots, General Popov, was sent there. Even Shoigu was removed from the Ministry of Defense, but the silent Gerasimov still remains in his seat. Although rumors of his dismissal have been spreading actively since last summer. And now, supposedly, there are actually grounds for them. If Gerasimov fails to capture Pokrovsk by mid-November, he will be replaced by a certain Viktor Viktorovich Paznikir, who was born and raised not far from the Ukrainian city of Sumy. Not much is known about him. He was awarded the Order of Zhukov by a classified decree, and in February 2024 he received the rank of Colonel General.
It's hard to call this military commander a media figure. His name was first mentioned in the media after the start of the operation in Syria. The Lieutenant General held the position of First Deputy Chief of the main operational directorate of the General Staff of the Russian Armed Forces. His briefings were dedicated to the situation around Palmyra and Aleppo, Paznikir also spoke about the work of the Russian military police in the Middle East and criticized the presence of American naval forces in the region. The Lieutenant General's statement about the US plans to develop a global missile defense system caused a major stir. At the Moscow Conference on International Security, Paznikir called Washington a likely adversary of Moscow. To overcome missile defense, Viktor Viktorovich proposed using the Sarmat and Avangard systems.
It is still unknown whether Gerasimov will be able to outsmart his adversaries again and hold on. Since the summer, the occupiers have been amassing troops in the Pokrovsk direction and probing for weak spots in the Ukrainian defense. On their side are Russia's vast resources, which they spare no expense to achieve their goals, and a huge number of fortune seekers lured by contracts and the new status of hero. And in 2025, Pokrovsk could become an important and decisive battle, much like the Chechen village of Komsomolskoye once was.
And now let's analyze the operational situation on the Alexandrovsk front, where the enemy is also becoming more aggressive. On the Alexandrovsk front, the enemy carried out 29 attacks yesterday in the areas of the settlements of Zeleny Gai, Yanvarskaya, Novosilovka, Voronoe, Sosnovka, Verbovoe, Alexevka, Rybnaya, Yegorovka, and Krasnogorskaya. Meanwhile, Putin's worst nightmare is coming true. Finland will conduct large-scale military exercises involving about 5,000 people. 15,000 military personnel will take part, with the exercises running from November to December in regions including those bordering directly with the Russian Federation. And in the swamps, there's real panic about this. In particular, the authorities in Karelia are forming people's militias to assist border guards on the border with Finland. All the details are in our next report. It is in effect.
Finland is taking preemptive action by deploying 15,000 troops to the border with Russia. The Finns are preparing for the largest series of military exercises of the year. Conscripts, reservists, career military personnel, as well as units from allied countries Sweden and the United Kingdom will take part in them. According to the country's ground forces, the purpose of the maneuvers is to test the army's readiness to defend the state and to strengthen cooperation with NATO allies.
On the territory of the occupying country, directly near the borders of Finland, there is currently intensive engineering construction of new military bases by the occupying country's army. This refers to Petrozavodsk, Kandalaksha and other settlements on the territory of the Russian Federation, which indicate the redeployment of Russian army units directly near the borders of Finland.
One of the largest episodes will be the Livalais Sentry exercise, which will take place in southern Finland from November 27th to December 4th. About 7,000 participants will be involved in it.
The Russian Federation has constantly made it clear to Finland what threat hangs over this country. Moreover, there has been a constant element of military political pressure on Finland with the aim, accordingly, of maintaining its so-called neutral status. There is not the slightest reason to say that after the occupation of Finnish lands, friendly and good neighborly relations were established. The Russian military presence near Finland's borders was constantly increasing.
In the spring of 2023, Finland became a member of the North Atlantic Alliance. This provoked a sharp reaction from Russia, worsening bilateral relations. In addition, Finland imposed sanctions against Russia and refused to grant asylum to Russians fleeing mobilization. After that, Putin's lackeys accused the Finns of every sin at every opportunity. For example, in September, former ALCO president Dmitry Medvedev decided that Finland was preparing to attack Russia.
After joining NATO under the guise of defensive measures, Helsinki is pursuing a confrontational course, preparing for war with Russia, apparently setting up a springboard for an attack on us.
Moreover, according to his version, Russia supposedly legally deserves reparations from the Finns for World War II, claiming that they once paid too little thanks to the goodwill of the Russians.
This is precisely an element of diplomatic and military pressure on Finland. Moreover, similar statements are being made not only regarding Finland, but also regarding Sweden, specifically about the island of Gotland, and accordingly regarding Poland.
Following the alcoholic Medvedev, the chairman of the State Duma Defense Committee, Andrei Kartapolov, also made aggressive statements. He stated, or rather threatened, that Russia is ready to defend itself at any moment since they have everything they need. Medvedev had previously spoken about this as well.
We simply cannot overlook the important fact that Finland is, at this moment, currently a member of the North Atlantic Alliance. This also determines changes in our military approaches to securing the border and responding to possible unfriendly acts.
The political and military leaders of Finland are doing everything they can to emphasize that an attack by Russia would be an act of suicidal madness. Nevertheless, the authorities in Karelia are strengthening the border with Finland with the help of volunteer patrols.
The Russian Federation is demonstrating its readiness for a direct confrontation with the NATO bloc. And accordingly, the first states that will be in the focus of the occupying country's army are respectively Finland and the Baltic states. Therefore, the risks are quite high. This is also evidenced by the formation of new military units in the Leningrad military district, and accordingly the deployment of military infrastructure directly near the borders with Finland.
Earlier, it became known that Finland had offered NATO to establish a new military base on its territory. Helsinki could become a base for large NATO reconnaissance drones.
And now it's time to analyze the operational situation on the much-suffering Kupiansk front. The situation here is, as usual, extremely tense. Yesterday, there were 13 attacks by the invaders on the Kupiansk front. Our defenders repelled enemy assault actions in the areas of the settlements of Stepnaya, Novosilovka, Borovskaya, Andreevka, and towards Petropavlovka, Kurilovka, and Peshanoe. Yes, the advance of the occupiers' army has been stopped in the Kupiansk area. The Ukrainian defense forces struck the Russians, which slowed down their offensive. This was stated by Viktor Tregubov, head of the communications department of the Joint Forces Group. More on what is happening at this hotspot on the front in our military review.
The situation in the Kupiansk direction remains difficult, but Ukrainian forces are confidently holding the defense and delivering precise strikes against Russian troops.
Russian plans to reach the city center are currently failing. Moreover, there is reason for cautious optimism, as even in the northern areas where they tried to concentrate their forces, things are not going well for them now. Several precise and heavy strikes were delivered against them. As a result, the offensive there has now stalled.
Klinik is now being forced to change tactics. Instead of a direct breakthrough to the city center, the Russians are trying to bypass Kupiansk from the flanks.
If anyone ends up encircled there, it definitely won't be the Ukrainian forces. There aren't enough Russians in the city or in the right positions to encircle anyone.
Nevertheless, the situation of the so-called double air blockade remains. Russian drones are capable of attacking Ukrainian logistics while being close to Kupiansk. However, Ukrainian drones are also delivering mirrored strikes against enemy infantry groups and equipment. Logistics are complicated for both sides, but control over key routes and transport hubs remains with the Ukrainian army.
Ukrainian reserves sent to stabilize Kupiansk. Additional operational reserves of Ukraine's defense forces have been deployed to Kupiansk to stabilize the situation in this settlement.
Kupiansk is not an end goal for the enemy, but rather a diversionary maneuver. According to experts, Russia is using a 1,000 cuts tactic, creating tension in secondary areas to distract attention from the main strike. According to the General Staff, the highest intensity of fighting is currently being recorded in the Pokrovsk direction. The
occupiers are facing a question: the redeployment of operational reserves. The point is that due to the water barrier, the river that divides Kupiansk, the occupiers are unable to quickly redeploy operational reserves and accordingly reinforce their assault groups. At the moment, the occupiers are trying to concentrate their main attack in the area of Kupiansk-Uzlovi. They are in dire need of control over this key railway station. A short logistics route, both from the territory of the Russian Federation and accordingly from the occupied areas of Luhansk region, would allow the occupiers to create a strike group which would then plan to advance along the Oskil River toward the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk agglomeration.
Things are not going well for the occupiers in the rear either. Ukrainian forces are carrying out preemptive strikes on the enemy's strategic targets, on ammunition depots and fuel and lubricants supply points. The goal is to deprive the Russians of the ability to supply their assault groups, to slow down their advance even before they reach the front lines.
Over the past week, Special Operations Forces drones have carried out a series of strikes on oil depots in the temporarily occupied territories. These were in the districts of Luhansk region, which were being used at the time to supply fuel and lubricants to units of the Russian occupation army, both in the Lyman direction and primarily in the Kupiansk direction. In particular, Special Operations Forces drones attacked oil depots in occupied Starobilsk, which is precisely the Kupiansk direction, and in Luhansk. Over the past day, drones from the Special Operations Forces of Ukraine's defense forces have struck a number of field fuel and lubricant depots in the temporarily occupied areas of Luhansk region, which is intended to reduce the intensity of attacks by Russian occupiers in this direction.
But while the situation on the battlefield is far from a breakthrough, on TV screens Moscow continues to claim victory. The Russian Ministry of Defense is once again reporting the capture of Kupiansk and the destruction of the 16th Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. But there's one catch: such a brigade doesn't exist. According to Moscow, this fictional brigade supposedly lost 8 soldiers, and Ukrainian units in Podpetrovka and Velika Shapkova have allegedly been encircled. But the reality remains unchanged. Heavy fighting continues near Kupiansk, but the city remains under Ukrainian control. Russian forces are taking losses, changing tactics, and searching for alternative routes. And Ukrainian defenders, despite the pressure, continue to hold the line and once again shatter the myth of the Kremlin's invincible army.
And now let's move to the southern Slobodansky sector of the front. The enemy army's bloody rampage continues here as well. In the southern Slobodansky direction, our forces repelled 12 enemy attacks in the areas of Vovchansk, Vovchansky Khutori, Tike, Otradne, and towards Kolodezne and Dvorichanske. A real manhunt has begun in the territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by the Russians. The occupiers are conducting raids, grabbing locals right off the streets and immediately sending them to the front lines. The details of this horror. Let's watch.
Oleg from the occupied Torres, that's in Donetsk region. On the 3rd day after his 18th birthday, he went to the local military enlistment office to register. He was told right away, either you sign the contract or it's prison. There is no third option. At
the enlistment office, they threatened me with prison. They said if I didn't sign, I'd be charged with the full article from 5 to 7 years. It was impossible to get out of the field camp. The control was extremely strict. At every corner of the camp, there were military patrols.
The inhumane treatment by Russian instructors drove young men to suicide. But even those who withstood this pressure did not live long. Those residents of the temporarily occupied territories who end up in the Russian army after a short training are sent straight into local assaults. Oleg was lucky; he surrendered immediately and survived.
Attitude toward the command of the hunters. Because we were from the occupied territories, they blamed us for everything that was happening, for the war. The command would often say, "Get there and we'll drop you some food." We would reach the designated point, but they never dropped anything. We lived in forest plantations without food or water. We chewed on whatever we could.
There are many people like Oleg. The temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine have been incorporated into the Southern Military District, and there are plans to recruit up to 100,000 soldiers for the Russian army from there. This was reported by Dmytro Kukarchuk, Deputy Commander of the 3rd Army Corps of the Ukrainian Armed Forces.
Russia has officially incorporated the occupied territories of Ukraine into the Southern Military District and is now beginning to mobilize the local population. The occupiers plan to mobilize between 50,000 and 100,000 men aged 18 to 55 to fight against Ukraine. Previously, mobilization only took place in the occupied territories of Donetsk, Luhansk regions, and Crimea.
The State Duma of the Russian Federation has passed a law that allows conscription into the army throughout the entire year, from January 1st to December 31st. Russia has legalized the conscription of residents from the temporarily occupied territories of Ukraine. Now, mobilization can be carried out all year round. According to the new rules, after receiving an electronic summons, a person is required to report to the so-called military enlistment office no later than 30 days later.
According to the CNS, the occupation military enlistment offices in Melitopol have already received instructions from Moscow to start compiling military lists of men, aged 18 to 50. In Melitopol, they are once again going door to door, checking documents, especially those of utility workers, construction workers, and security guards, people who can be quickly sent to the second line without preparation.
Previously, mobilization activities were carried out only in the occupied territories of Donetsk, Luhansk regions, and in Crimea. Now they have expanded to all occupied regions, which indicates another attempt by the Kremlin to make up for losses at the front at the expense of
Ukrainians. The personnel of the so-called 1st and 2nd Army Corps, which are military units operating under the authority of the self-proclaimed LNR, or Luhansk People's Republic, have experienced a notable increase in their numbers. The total number of personnel in these two Army Corps rose from an already considerable force of 35,000 individuals in the year 2022 to a much larger and more formidable strength of 100,000 people. Now, in some cities in the occupied territories of Luhansk region, local residents themselves call them women's towns. Not because, well, let's say it's not a derogatory term. It's due to the complete absence of male population. Total mobilization.
losses in local assaults have to be compensated somehow. The number of contract soldiers as well as the money for them is decreasing. Total mobilization in the temporarily occupied territories is an attempt to make up for the losses. Having survived, and after being captured by the Ukrainians, Oleg realized that his life in the Russian army wasn't worth a dime.
After ending up in the Russian army, I realized it's all bullshit, because they just want to wipe us all out here.
Now let's analyze the operational situation on the Sloviansk and Kramatorsk fronts. On the Sloviansk front, the defense forces repelled 8 enemy attacks near Serebryanka, Dronivka, Fedorivka, and towards Siversk. On the Kramatorsk front, there were 2 combat clashes yesterday. The invader tried to advance near the settlement of Shasiv Yar and towards Stuposhki. Now, attention! Russia has upgraded the Shaheds, and now it's even harder to intercept them. And the most unpleasant part is that, attention, the American side is actually helping the Russians with this. How is that possible? What is even going on? What should we do about this? Let's figure it out together, step by step.
Besides the war on the front lines, there is also a technological war going on.
Our enemy is, let's say, technologically dangerous, cunning, and unpredictable, because they can change everything in an instant.
Communication systems, control systems, and electronic warfare play a significant role. The key issue is complexity in order to be able to counter the enemy.
The speeds are no longer the same. The enemy uses various means to make their drones less vulnerable to our electronic warfare. In
2024, jet-powered Shaheds equipped with electronic warfare countermeasures were spotted over Ukraine.
In fact, they are trying to turn the large, unwieldy Shahed into an FPV analog, which is controlled via radio channel directly from the territory of the Russian Federation or from occupied territory. This Shahed is equipped with an onboard video camera that can transmit footage directly. And again, let me repeat, we're not talking about mobile communication with Ukraine. We're not talking about LTM or DEM. We're talking about a special dedicated modem. I brought it to show you. It's about the size of a brick, and it allows radio channel information to be transmitted directly to Russia.
This is not the first time the Shahed has been upgraded by the Russians in an attempt to bypass Ukrainian air defenses. CRPA antennas are devices that allow drones to maintain navigation even under intense electronic jamming. These antennas are currently produced in Russia, but the technology was originally developed in Ukraine back in the early 2000s. Now, on enemy territory in 2025, the modernization of these birds of death continues. This
principal electronic warfare, absolutely every element that a radio receiver has can be jammed. Some are harder, some are easier. It depends on the type of signal. In this case, jamming isn't exactly easy because they use frequency hopping technology across the entire range, which makes it resistant to electronic warfare jamming, but it is still quite possible. So for this, we just need to take a new approach, so to speak, and adapt ourselves to the Russians' new tactics.
The Russians have gone even further. They hid these antennas inside the body, removed them from the wing, and moved them inside the Shahed, placing them in the center. As a result, the enemy's drones are becoming virtually invulnerable to electronic warfare systems.
What does this tell an observant and intelligent person? It means that the factory made changes to the Shahed's body specifically for these Chinese antennas. This means the enemy is confident in a long-term and stable partnership with China. We cannot suppress such antennas with our existing electronic warfare systems everywhere across the country.
Sergei Beskresnov also confirmed in a flash that this nuance indicates close cooperation between Russia and China. Russian billionaires are doing everything they can to help Putin in this war, establishing contacts with China and the US. For example, Deripaska.
Access to technology and equipment is also closed off, and there is a range of items that are critical. In
2024, the Russian LLC Angar 22 purchased Swivin turbojet engines for a total of about $300,000. Officially, they were intended for model aviation. However, these units later found a completely different use. They were installed on a jet-powered modification of the Iranian Shahed drone. At the same time, the owners of Angar 22 are classified and information about the beneficiaries is hidden. According to old registry data, the founder was the joint stock company Kraska, which was linked to Deripaska. Other subsidiary structures, according to documents, are only partially state-owned. But there is also the development corporation Yuginvest. It is associated with a structure belonging to the same Deripaska.
We are familiar with China's experience. Free economic zones, minimal taxes, joint ventures.
Supplies to the company linked to Putin's wallet were delivered directly from the Chinese manufacturer Swivin, which also has an American branch, Swivin USA. Angar 22 is already under American sanctions. In fact, the story of Angar is an illustration of how the Russian military-industrial complex, cut off from Western technology, seeks workarounds, indirectly cooperating with the United States through China under the guise of scientific research. Updates its drones to carry out attacks on Ukraine. In the Russian Federation, they have started making them even more deadly for strikes. During attacks on the Sumy region, Russian occupiers began using Shaheds with anti-tank
mines attached to them. And as we should clearly understand, having access to resources, having sufficient finances, and having every possible opportunity, in other words, they will not stop. They will continue to persist, making use of all the means and advantages available to them, and they will not be deterred easily.
Monitoring groups report that the Russian Federation is preparing Shaheds with phosphorus munitions. Being within 150 meters of the impact zone can result in fatal outcomes. The Kremlin is betting specifically on cheap kamikaze drones, not missiles. That is why they plan to increase the production of Shaheds and other types of UAVs. A plan has been set to produce at least 36,000 strike drones. The Ukrainian side is not resting on its laurels and continues to work on improving its own interceptor drones. And not only that,
That's all for today, but very soon there will be new updates on the Front News program. Unique materials from our journalists in the hottest spots of the war, obtained so that you know the truth. This was Vladimir Timoshenko with you. Take care of yourselves and your loved ones.